Eminent domain, for those who aren't familiar with the term, is a power given to the government from the Constitution, which gives cities and the federal government the power to take private property in order to use the land for public good. When used for the public good, this power can be extremely beneficial for the public, as it has historically been used for improvements in transportation, park conservation, and public utilities. It's what largely made our highway system and acclaimed national parks possible. However, with several Supreme Court rulings that take a more general view of what constitutes public good, eminent domain has been used more and more for a public purpose. Usually, taking property for private institutions that will increase the economic value of the land and bring in more money for the city. This abuse of eminent domain has been used increasingly since the mid-20th century for cities to try to revamp their economies by replacing small businesses and blighted areas with corporate landscapes and residences for higher-income citizens. But does trying to replace these communities in favor of private development plans actually help the areas and people that it affects? I analyzed this case, Kelo v. City of New London, and the history of eminent domain abuse to see the cultural, political, and economic impacts and factors of eminent domain on communities and cities to answer this question. The case of Kelo v. City of New London began in 2002, when a woman named Suzette Kelo sued the City of New London, Connecticut for trying to take her house and other neighboring residences as part of the city's redevelopment plan. The city used eminent domain to justify the taking of the Fort Trumbull neighborhood, but the issue was taken to court because the city was using a private company, the New London Development Corporation, for the redevelopment plan. The plan the city had involved a major pharmaceutical corporation, Pfizer, and would provide offices and other facilities for the corporation. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the City of New London in the Kelo v. New London case in a 5-4 decision, and despite a lengthy and hard fight, the Fort Trumbull neighborhood was demolished.
I heard somebody finally bought this place.
Suzette Kelo.
Welcome to the neighborhood.
Thank you. I feel happy here. I feel like I'm home.
I love you.
Mr. Governor.
We take this plot of land and we redevelop it. Lure a world-class company.
The state of Connecticut will make sure that you succeed.
Guess who's coming to town? Pfizer.
The best course for us would be to acquire all the homes.
The Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, it's eminent domain. They can take your home, they can take your land. It's perfectly legal.
I need to talk to the mayor, please. Regarding? It's regarding the people who are trying to steal my house.
Do we need to be concerned?
What brings you to New London? With the Institute for Justice? Are you here to help the Fort Trumbull folks?
We're gonna take your case. We need to take these people on.
If I haven't left some blood on the battlefield, I haven't done enough.
This is somebody's home!
They did it to intimidate Suzette, to let her know she's next.
If you even try to take my property away from me, the whole world is going to hear about it.
The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear your case.
Oh, my God.
The city's lawyers should hang their heads in shame at what they're doing to their citizens and to the Constitution of the United States.
What you're doing is right. What they're doing, it's wrong.
My wife and I grew up in this neighborhood. This is the only house we've ever lived in.
No amount of money could replace our homes. This is where we chose to settle, and this is where we want to stay. I'm scared.
You would put working-class neighborhoods in jeopardy.
This land is everything I have. It's all I own.
The public backlash against the ruling was immediate and led to many reconsiderings of the power of eminent domain and its benefits. The Kelo ruling was not the first Supreme Court ruling to broaden the power of eminent domain for cities. In fact, it reinforced the rulings of previous cases that had made the Kelo ruling possible. While the ruling of these cases, such as Berman and Midkiff, were contested during the case, they weren't overruled. Despite Kelo not being a landmark case for new developments and property rights, it garnered attention because of the fight of the woman behind it, Suzette Kelo, and because it showed the public how much power cities possess when redeveloping areas. Eminent domain has a history of disproportionately affecting minorities and low-income communities. In the mid-20th century, when it started to be used for urban renewal, the primary target was black neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were labeled as blighted, and instead of providing resources for the struggling communities, cities like Detroit and D.C. broke them apart in favor of industrial landscapes. In a U.S. census, 58% of those targeted by eminent domain were minorities. In trying to improve the economy of these targeted neighborhoods, cities are harming the people living there by the forceful displacement of residents and disregarding the existing communities and businesses that exist. Eminent domain is a unique political issue because of its cross-ideology. Both liberals and conservatives usually feel similar ways about it. The Kelo decision in particular was opposed by both sides of the political spectrum. Because it isn't necessarily a partisan issue, it becomes easier on a state level for a reform legislator to pass through. But there are supporters of eminent domain and the Kelo ruling that argue that the work of trying to revitalize an area's economy using the private sector in conjunction with the government is necessary and that cities must retain this power. They argue that cities are too slow-moving and unreliable to complete these kind of large-scale projects on their own. While local governments may not be the fastest institution for these types of redevelopments, the fact is that private companies are even more unreliable. This is demonstrated within the Kelo case itself. After the ruling, when the Fort Trumbull neighborhood was cleared to make room for Pfizer, the company backed out of the development deal, and the land that was once a neighborhood with long-term residents became an empty lot. The Kelo case should serve as a reminder that while the government is required to serve their citizens, the only people corporations are concerned with serving are their stockholders. Giving them and cities the power to use land that is privately owned is an unwise idea, proven by Suzette Kelo's story. The main argument for the majority side on the Supreme Court case ruling was that the city's need for an increase in tax revenue qualified as public use. But for many cities, the economic benefit of eminent domain is little to none. A study by researchers at Florida Gulf Coast University found virtually no evidence of economic benefit under eminent domain. In fact, the researchers found a negative relationship between use of eminent domain and increased tax revenue. This information shouldn't be surprising when taking into account the fact that by using eminent domain to make way for corporate landscapes, cities are losing revenue from residents, businesses, and communities. Because the corporations that cities partner with don't always follow through, more often than not, these cities are losing their current revenues in favor for a possible larger one. Cities shouldn't turn to eminent domain as their only option for a revenue increase. It would be wiser for them to instead invest in the so-called blighted communities and research why their economies are struggling instead of just trying to replace it all. The outspoken public reactions from the Kelo case resulted in 45 states passing legislative reform about eminent domain. And while some of the states, such as South Dakota, were successful in this reform, many of these quick legislations have been criticized for having loopholes and allowing private eminent domain abuse to continue happening under a different name. But the attention garnered from the case still continues today, and property rights remain a battle in the United States court system. More than 10 years after the Kelo ruling, the land where Suzette Kelo's house once stood remains barren, but her story isn't done being told. Several books about the Kelo case have been published, and a movie directed by Courtney Moorhead called Little Pink House came out earlier this year. And the economic benefits from the ruling? To quote an article from The Hill, after spending millions of dollars of taxpayer money and forcing several hard-working families from their homes, this economic development plan was a complete failure. As it stands now, because of the Supreme Court cases that give so much power to cities, if we truly want reform, it will be up to the states and proposed legislator from people that are trying to do more than seek re-election.